So what I want to do tonight is to talk to you about what we did with the Climate Commission and really frame it around some of my sort of personal learnings, I suppose, over the last 2.5 years, the key messages that we delivered and how those key messages changed over time as we learnt stuff as we went along, and also then follow up, as Monique introduced, with some of the hopes and aspirations for the Climate Council going forward. So this is just a snapshot of some of our forums that we had with the Climate Commission. As you can see, there's some former luminaries of the former government and present government there from our forum that we did in Parliament House, but I'll get to that in a moment. Okay, is that going to go? Okay, we were actually launched in February 2011, and that was the original lineup. The Climate Commission itself was actually, the idea was put forward sometime before that by Prime Minister Gillard at the same time that 150-person assembly was also suggested that was going to come up with a consensus on climate change. And I think everybody except the Prime Minister thought that that was a really kind of silly idea, and it was quietly dropped. And because there was so much media attention on that idea, the fact that she'd actually announced that there would be a Climate Commission was missed by almost everybody, including all of us. Anyway, in about the January of 2011, we all received phone calls from various people saying, would you be interested in getting together with a group of people that you don't actually know very well and doing this thing? And it sounded like a pretty interesting opportunity, so the 6 of us said yes. So just to introduce them for those that don't know, so Will Stephan on the end, climate scientist from ANU. Roger Beale next in the other tie, he's an economist, former head of the Department of Environment in Canberra, a long-time public servant, now works with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Me, Tim Flannery, I'm sure I don't need to introduce Tim, the Chief Commissioner. Susanna Elliott, who's the head of the Science Media Centre in Adelaide, and Jerry Houston on the end, former CEO of BP Australasia and in the oil and gas industry from the dark side for about 30 odd years, but also former chair of the Sustainable Business Council, which is how he got to know Tim. Susanna stepped down after a year and was replaced with Veena Sahajwala, who's a chemical engineer, professor of chemical engineering at UNSW. So that was the merry band, and we were supported by an absolutely fantastic secretariat within the Department of Climate Change. There was a fair bit of, as public servants tend to sort of rotate fairly regularly, so we had a rather rotating team of people, but I have to say they were all fantastic. These were our terms of reference, was to provide an independent and reliable source of information on climate change science, on international action and on carbon pricing. It's important to know what we did not do, because there was a lot of misinformation and confusion about what we were and what we weren't. We have never been an advisory body to the government, nor were we subject to government direction. We were truly independent. Even though we received our funding from the government, we never at any stage, I can assure you, received any form of ministerial direction as to what we should do. The only exception to that was actually when the government went into caretaker mode before the election, we were also subject to caretaker mode, much to our chagrin. And neither were we responsible for advising or setting emissions targets. That is the job of the Climate Change Authority, which is a legislated body, which still does exist till they legislate them out of existence. But there was a lot of confusion as to our relative roles. We have done lots and lots of activities, including the public forums that I'll talk about in a moment. But when we went to places to do these forums, what we also did was meet with councils, Moreland I think we met with local businesses, large and small. That's the bottom left-hand shot there is the oil refinery at Geelong, for example. So we really got around the country, met lots and lots of people, wore lots of hard hats and things and shiny vests. We ended up doing about nearly 30 public forums in every state and territory. We met, I think we sort of spoke to face, probably thousands of people. The average size of those forums was probably 300 or 400 people. Then we did a lot of business breakfasts and that sort of thing, and then we communicated with probably hundreds of thousands of people, if not, you know, maybe 1 million or 2 through our website. And over the last 2.5 years, when I sort of started to think about, well, what sort of messages did we end up delivering? These are my personal key messages that evolved over that period. Of course, this is the key message that sometimes you really want to say, because it can be, as I'm sure you're all aware, intensely frustrating to deal with a certain level of ignorance, and both willful and real ignorance in the community, and sometimes you just feel like saying that. And we couldn't ever say that. Bloomberg can. But my first key message was that it's really a lot of climate science communication, as all communication, it's all about how you frame the message. So I just wanted, to illustrate this, I just want to put up a few statements and talk about, for each of these messages, I want to talk about what the message behind the message actually is. So here's a statement: Australia is responsible for 1.5% of global emissions. And even when I see that number, somewhere in the back of my mind, I think this, well, that's a pretty small number, and that's one of the problems with this message. It is quite a small number when you think about it. Here's another statement: Australia's per capita emissions are the highest of any developed country. What's the message that unconsciously springs to mind? Well, you know, you start feeling a bit guilty thinking about that. Australia is the 15th highest emitter in absolute carbon terms. That's starting to get a bit more serious, and there are 180 countries in the world that emit less than we do. If you frame it like that, the subtext is that we're actually a fairly serious global player in this space. Now, the thing about all these messages is that they're all actually true, but they deliver very, very different sort of unconscious and perhaps conscious messages to people that hear them. So thinking about how messages are framed, I think is really important. Okay, so to go on to now my 9 key messages, and I'm not going to give you a lecture on climate science by any means, but just to use some illustrations as I go along to illustrate the sorts of things that we've been trying to get across to people in the community. So the first one, of course, is the climate is changing. This is not hypothetical. You can show all sorts of graphs. That's the ocean temperature going up. And these changes are having big impacts on the physical structure of the Earth's surface, such as glaciers melting, Arctic sea ice melting, record Arctic sea ice in the northern summer last year. The difference between those 2 satellite photos took place in 4 days. So there was one photo, the 8th of July, second photo on the 12th of July, and they actually didn't release them for a few days because they thought there was a mistake with the cameras, with the satellite. And so the really underpinning message of all of these sorts of graphs, and I mean I could have shown you hundreds of them of course, is that climate change is not just a problem for the future, it's a problem for now. Things are happening now. Okay, the second really important key message is that there is scientific consensus on why these things are happening. And there's a big mismatch between the actual consensus and the public perception of consensus. And these 2 figures come from the work of John Cook. Many of you will be familiar with the Skeptical Science app and website, which is a fantastic resource. John is doing his PhD on climate science communication, as you might expect. About 97–98% of climate scientists who actually practice in the field agree, this was in a few years ago when the survey was done, agree that human activity is causing the climate to change. The public perception of the level of consensus is actually quite different. The public perception is that there's only 45% of the public think that there's a scientific consensus, 55% of the public think that things are basically unsettled. And the reason why this is so important is that there's a lot of psychology research done that shows that people are more likely to accept something if they think lots of other people agree about it. So actually getting across the message that actually scientists agree about this is a really important part of framing the message to the public. Okay, the third key message is about extreme events, and when an extreme event happens, as we've seen the last couple of weeks in Sydney where I live with the bushfires, all of a sudden everybody starts talking about climate change and they're saying, well, is this climate change or isn't it? You know, and you will have seen some of the press on that. So we've had lots of extreme events. This is the picture from the hottest day in Australian history in the instrumental record last January the 7th, I think it was, where the Bureau of Meteorology had to come up with a new colour for the climate map because they didn't have a colour for over 54 degrees before. Now, I'm showing this quote from a paper that was published last year because it's a really important, I think, a really important way of cutting through this whole issue of, well, is this event climate change or not? And it's a paper by a guy called Kevin Trenberth, who's a very well-known international climate scientist. And what he said in it was this: the answer to the oft-asked question of whether an event is caused by climate change is that it's the wrong question. All weather events are affected by climate change because the environment in which they occur is now warmer and moister than it used to be. And with those two sentences, I think Trenberth succeeded in cutting through this whole morass of people twisting themselves in knots saying, well, is this climate change or isn't it? Yes, it's all climate change. The climate is different. It's very different from what it was 50 years ago. All weather and all climate is now affected by climate change. Let's actually move on past this sort of stamp collecting of whether I'll collect this event as a climate change event, but not that event. And it is really part of the message that we've been trying to deliver in the last couple of weeks about the bushfires. Fourth type of key message is what the impacts actually are and what they mean. When a lot of people, I think, in the public hear messages about climate change, this is the sort of image they have in mind, you know. Yes, that we know the polar ice caps are melting. It's really bad for polar bears. That's a real shame. But you know, unless I'm an Inuit, that is not going to really affect my everyday life. So our next key message is that in fact there are significant risks for all sectors, not just if you're a polar bear, whether it be health or tourism or mining or extreme events, agriculture, people that live in cities, people that live on the coast. All sectors are affected in some way by the changing climate. And so the subtext behind this message is that climate change is not just an environmental problem. And this is a really important message because unfortunately, and I know that nobody in this room will be like this, there's a lot of people out there that really don't care about the environment. But they do care about their health, they do care about the economy, they do care about their families. So actually framing the climate change message as being much broader than simply an environmental problem that Greenies care about is also really important. And of course we've seen all sorts of impacts here in Victoria. That's Horsham a couple of years ago, bushfires, etc. That's Melbourne in the heat wave in January 2009 when all the trains buckled in Melbourne. And a lot of you would have been having difficulty getting home. Okay, but there's some good news in all of this. The world is actually acting, and one of the reports that the Climate Commission put out was about international action in climate change to counter this message that was coming from some of our politicians that Australia shouldn't act first because we'll be disadvantaged, we don't want to lead on this issue. Well, here's the message: we're not leading on the issue. There are 35 countries ahead of us on that issue. So Australia isn't going it alone, and in fact, sending out the message that unless we get into the sort of the carbon market space and become a world player, we will actually be economically left behind. But here's the bad news. It's not enough, of course. Even if all of the pledges that were made in the Cancun meeting in 2010 were kept, it's still only half the emissions reduction that we actually need to keep below that 2-degree guardrail, because emissions are still going up. And some of you will have seen these graphics. They come from the Critical Decade report that we put out earlier this year. And basically, it's to get across this idea that so far we are not being nearly ambitious enough. So if we look at this problem through the carbon budget approach, which I'm sure lots of you are familiar with, the calculation is that between now and 2050 we can only emit 1,000 billion tonnes to have a 75% chance of keeping below the 2 degrees, and we've already emitted 40% of that budget in the first 13 years. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of other calculations that people have done to say, okay, well, how much of the fossil fuels that we know we have as reserved in the ground can we afford to burn to stay within this budget? And it's about 80% of all of the fossil fuel reserves that we know are there, simply we cannot afford to burn. So it's this new, really quite new idea of unburnable carbon. So that's another of our messages. We cannot afford to dig everything up. The other message, of course, is that if we fail to do that, there is a very significant probability of at least a 4-degree of warming. Seventh message is about timing, and the critical decade has been our mantra right from the beginning. I think Will came up with this as the title for our very first report, and we've really stuck with it. What this graph shows is that the speed of trajectory of how much and how quickly you need to reduce emissions in order to reach that target of decarbonisation by about the middle of the century. So if we look at this bottom line, that's what would happen if we were able to peak emissions back in 2011. We could have reduced emissions 3.7% every year to achieve roughly that goal. If we peak in 2015, we have to do it much more steeply. We have to reduce emissions about 5.3% per year. If we wait till 2020 for that peak to come, then we have to reduce at 9% a year, which is a very, very steep reduction indeed. And so the message underlying this is it's not too late, but the longer we wait, the more danger there is that we simply will find it impossible to meet that budget. So the eighth message is that Australia, and this is where you guys come in, of course, has lots of opportunities. And we put out a couple of reports about renewable energy, a big one about solar energy, to say, look, this country has immense natural resources, immense wealth of renewable energy possibilities. We need to capitalise on that. We do not need to burn coal at all. And I think it's a really important thing to do to deliver positive messages as well as the catastrophic messages, because as you probably are all aware, if we deliver too many catastrophic messages, such as some of the ones that I've delivered earlier in this talk, people simply shut down. They can't cope, and it's easier to deny things than to be in a permanent state of depression. And this is the last one, and I know some of you have seen, and Paul actually told me he's seen this one twice, I think. This is a slide that I came up with at one of our early forums, because I was showing the underlying graph, which is about the future. It's about what we could have. So here's the temperature that we've had so far up to, about 2012 or 13 or so. Here's what we could have if we reduce emissions pretty sharply and keep below that 2 degrees. And under a business as usual scenario, well, it's the red future there. Possibly 5, possibly 7 degrees by the end of the century. And when you put graphs up like this to the general public, at least 2/3 of the audience's eyes simply glaze over. They just don't really understand it, they don't want to understand it, it's a sciencey sort of thing. So I puzzled about how to try to make a graph like this, which I find a very powerful graph, mean something to the average punter. So I decided, well, I'll make it personal. I'll put me on there. So here's my lifespan. If I live till I'm 85 or so, born in the 60s, and that line has been drawn at the average temperature that I will experience over my lifetime. And I've got 2 teenage kids born in the mid-90s. So under this business as usual scenario, this is the line, this is the temperature. It'll be about on 2 degrees on average that they will experience over their lifetime. Now, I don't have any grandchildren yet, my kids are still teenagers, but if they have kids when they're, say, about 30 and my grandkids live till they're 85, they live into the next century. So the next century, when you think about it like that, is actually not very far away. So I've been showing this graph at every forum. I put it up as an experiment without telling the other commissioners at one of the forums, and people responded to it and they said, yeah, that meant something to me. And so, you know, the ultimate key message is that climate change is a personal thing. This is about, not just about polar bears, it's about us, it's about our kids, it's about our grandkids. So some reflections on the journey that we've had. There are, of course, still doubters, both politically and in the general public, but I don't believe they're as sceptical or as negative as the media would have us think. There is still a lot of confusion about the science, but hopefully we've been able to provide for those that want to read it some accessible information. As I've seen over the last couple of weeks in Sydney with the bushfires, still an enormous amount of confusion about cause and effect and trends and all of that sort of thing. The job is by no means done. There is huge frustration, I'm sure you've all felt it, with the partisan political approach and how this issue, you know, which is the biggest issue facing the planet, has become so politicised in Australia, and huge frustration with a lot of aspects of the media that fan the debate, because of course it's not much of a story, if everybody agrees. We have seen that the catastrophic predictions that we're all kind of fond of talking about do turn off a lot of people, and we need to reframe a lot of messages to show that there is a positive and better way forward of living our lives. And there is an enormous thirst, and of course I'm preaching to the converted, which I'll talk about in a minute, for positive action and opportunities. And we saw this especially not just in inner city greeny areas like this one, but actually out in the country in regional areas as well. And I think our main issue is this, to convey urgency. This is not something that we can just keep putting off and let somebody else figure out a clever technological fix later on because of that time lag issue. When we started, and this is going to frame my last reflection, we were presented by CSIRO with some survey results from a survey that they'd done, I think in 2010, about attitudes to climate change. And there's been lots of these sorts of surveys. The results differ between surveys because they differ between the particular sample and how you've asked the question, etc. But this was presented to us right at the beginning when we started. So there was this sort of little rump of people that don't think the climate change is happening at all, or don't care. But it's quite a small, that sort of hardcore denialism is actually quite a small wedge. About 50% of people said, yes, climate's changing, we're doing it. And about 40% said, climate's changing, I'm not convinced that it's not just natural variability. Now, when we started on the Climate Commission, I at least felt that we could sort of not worry about the denialists because they're not going to change their mind anyway, not worry about the 50.4% that were on side, but the 40.2%, that was our focus. The ones that were sort of halfway there that just needed to be convinced that it really is humans. And I've actually changed my mind about that because we were often sort of accused in a pejorative way of preaching to the converted when we'd go and do these forums. And after 2.5 years of preaching to the converted, I decided that preaching to the converted is actually what you absolutely need to do. It's absolutely fine to preach to the converted because it's the converted that are going to take action. So I've really changed my position on that pie chart, and I actually think our target now is that 50% that's already on side, because after all, you can be very concerned about climate change but still do nothing. It's the 50% that have a chance of doing something. So actually preaching to those converted and inspiring them and encouraging them and motivating them to take action is actually more important than trying to convince the rest of the population. Then, of course, we had an election. Now, I have to say, and I know this is on tape, so I have to be very careful what I say here. I'll say that one thing in the Coalition's favour is that they didn't surprise us. You know, they told us to our faces, Greg Hunt in the office, many, many months before, and went on the public record that they would abolish the Climate Commission if they gained office. So I must admit I still had this sort of slight, vague little hope in my head that maybe they wouldn't go through with it, but no, they did go through with it. But it wasn't a surprise. We had already had discussions about what we might do next. We were already committed before the election and before we were abolished to keeping on going. So, as Monique mentioned, we now have been reborn. We are a phoenix that has risen from the ashes of the Climate Commission with a new logo, completely different to the old logo. We've kept the two Cs because we always thought that was sort of nice. An independent, crowd-funded organisation to provide quality information to the Australian public is our little kind of logo. So, also, as Monique said, we were launched in September 23rd. We began our appeal at midnight that day. By that afternoon, really, it was actually less than 24 hours, we'd raised $220,000. PayPal actually shut down about halfway through the afternoon because they thought there was something fraudulent going on because there was just so much traffic. The Twitter feed shut down also. It was completely overloaded. It just went mad. Unfortunately, I was overseas at the time and I kind of missed all the excitement, and I'm really sorry about that. We do have over 20,000 donors. Thank you very much to anybody in this room who has donated. We have lots of likes on Facebook. We now have over 8,000 Twitter followers, and it's interesting because when we're on the Commission we had 3,000, and I sort of liken this to what happens when an artist dies and then their paintings go up in value. We have become much more well known because we've been sacked than we ever were when we were alive. And, you know, in a sense, Mr Abbott in lots of ways did us a favour, did the issue a favour. I'm sure he wouldn't see it like that, because even lots of people that had never heard of the Commission actually did hear of it when we were abolished. And I think the sort of visceral reaction to that was what prompted a lot of people to donate who probably had never really thought about climate change before but were just incensed at what had happened. So we thank them as well. So we are up and going. We haven't as yet had all the councillors, so all the commissioners, or most of the commissioners, will transition into being councillors now. We also, I should say, have, so we have raised over, well over $1 million. We have the public response has been quite extraordinary, not just with money. We have, for example, we're about to move into offices in Elizabeth Bay that have been donated to us free of charge for a year, a whole suite of offices in the eastern suburbs. We have people just wanting to donate furniture, just everything. And actually organising and taking advantage of all of that goodwill and all the volunteers is actually going to be a very significant issue for us, because you have to actually spend resources to use resources like that, and we're still sort of feeling our way. We have got some staff already. As part of our planning process, the communications advisor for the Commission, Amanda Mackenzie, who would be well known to many of you, she and Anna Rose started the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, really quite an extraordinary young woman. She has become our CEO, and she's really the driving force behind the council, and she's basically organising everything. So we have some staff. We're about to be advertised for some sort of permanent positions. We have a recruitment agency who's acting for us for almost nothing to do this, which is, you know, another example of volunteers coming out of the woodwork wanting to help. We also have several large corporate donors that we are setting up a separate fund for. So that's where we are at the moment. We decided back in September that our first report would be on climate change and bushfires, because we knew we were going to have a big bushfire season because winter had been so warm and dry. Will and I started working on the report, and then of course events overtook us and we have been in a bushfire season. And so if I didn't have to spend so much time talking to journalists about bushfires, I'd actually have got further with writing the bushfire report, but we hope to have that ready in about a month. It will be reviewed by experts and we'll release it either the end of November or the first week of December. So that's where we are, and I'd be really happy to answer questions and to open it up for discussion. Thank you very much.